What I'm going to tell you now is a story, and it is a story that is not new, but that does not make it unworthy. There is power in the sound of our voices, in the repetition of the same story by many voices, until it becomes louder, loud enough to be heard by all. I'm a very curious person. Sometimes when I find a thread, I just have to follow it. And as Yannick said, if you say you will go to the temple, then you have to go to that temple. It is where our prayers become manifestations in the physical. Footage from this visual essay is all taken from the 3 weeks that I spent in Nepal learning about the Newar indigenous people of the Kathmandu Valley and spending time listening, learning, asking questions, and having an adventure or two. We stayed in a hostel in Lalitpur, located in the municipality of Patan, which is known as the Ancient City. It features countless heritage sites. One of the many workshops we completed over 3 weeks was led by Ang Dolma Sherpa. I was fortunate enough to have an hour of her time to interview her about organic prayer flags, her business that she runs called Utpala Handicrafts. The name, she says, comes from her time spent working on her business in its early days at the Cafe Utpala and Buddha, where many Buddhist students would go on their breaks to study. Their dedication to their studies inspired her to continue pursuing the formation of her business despite a lot of challenges and personal conflict at the time of its formation, which culminated during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The word Utpala comes from the Buddhist symbol for the lotus flower. The lotus flower, as we've learned on this trip, is an incredibly potent and powerful symbol as it naturally symbolizes the resilience and beauty that comes from a muddy growing place. But beyond this, it symbolizes enlightenment, and it supports the Lord Buddha as the flower supports the world above the chaotic waters of the universe. In coming to Nepal, I understood prayer flags as ubiquitous to Tibetan Buddhist and Himalayan culture. My only previous exposure has been when I was 17. A high school teacher of mine visited Nepal and brought my classmates and I back each a souvenir. It was a small plastic package, and folded on top of each other were 10 individual small colorful flags connected with a red ribbon. Each flag was printed with a different syllable, a sound that represents what I understood at the time to be a prayer. I actually remember reading those mantras out loud for the time that flag hung above my head, over my bed. Om Mani Padma Hum. I didn't even know what they meant, but it sounded right when I said them. I never said it in front of anyone. I would just whisper it to myself in my room sometimes. Om Mani Padme Hum. I was interested in studying Ang Dolma Sherpa's business models for many reasons. For one, she's presented a product to a market that is completely unique, and yet it's rooted in the preservation of tradition. She shared to me that traditionally, Buddhist prayer flags were made of cotton, and their purpose is to disintegrate over time as the message printed on them gets released into the spiritual realm. Secondly, her dedication towards a sustainable business practice caught my attention because of how it relates to the kind of preservation and protection that Indigenous rights activists are arguing for on many fronts in Nepal. Ang Dolma was inspired by her own mother's act of preservation, where she would upcycle and reuse as many products in their home as possible. And that culture of not letting anything go to waste is similar to the kind of work that the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, which is also known as CPRID, details in their report about the various efforts to implement. For one example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which will protect natural spaces and also help create legal frameworks to protect the Indigenous people of Nepal, including the Sherpa people, and the right to self-determine and govern in their own territory, as well as gain recognition in the state and global level. Finally, Ang Dolma's business also represents a dedication towards a more decolonial and feminist ideology. Although many say Nepal was never colonized, some of our teachers here have shared that this doesn't mean colonialism is not present. In Nepal, there are approximately 59 distinct indigenous groups, and within that number, 1/4 of the indigenous population is represented by women. Indigenous women are the custodians of lands, territories, resources, and knowledge holders for climate resilience, conservation, biodiversity, and ecosystem. Ang Dolma's practice of running her business is centered on encouraging her employees to feel a sense of self-agency. She attributes this model that she adopted partly to the COVID-19 pandemic's impact and shift of production process to be done more remotely. In some cases, she gave her artisans a loan to be able to buy their own garment machines, meaning they would have the freedom of ownership and pursue other career paths with these assets. And moreover, her employees have flexible work hours. She encourages them to focus on completing tasks and deadlines rather than simply showing up to an in-person office, which also helps to create a more economic model of business. Researcher Catherine Paul Ann from the University of Wisconsin writes in her dissertation from 2003 that not a lot of academic research has been done into prayer flags. However, she does importantly point out that there are 4 types of Tibetan sources for regarding prayer flags. Firstly, there are the Tibetan scholars, monks, and students who are currently publishing or have published in the recent past very valuable materials regarding Tibetan culture, in which prayer flags are given auxiliary mentions into the main point of their work. Second, there are frequent abbreviated references to prayer flags provided in Tibetan calendars, almanacs, and astrological treatises. Third, there are old Tibetan texts that peripherally relate to prayer flags, and in particular portions of medical treatises, certain ritual texts, pilgrimage guidebooks, and histories. And fourth, there are texts that appear on the prayer flags themselves. This quote illustrates the need for further research into the impact of the kind of work that someone like Ang Dolma Sherpa is doing to create more sustainable alternatives to the wasteful and environmentally harmful practice of purchasing and hanging mass-scale prayer flags for ritual use. Again, in the words of Catherine Paul, prayer flags are a concrete component, a specific type of physical evidence that is used in a multi-layered ritual tradition. Using prayer flags to filter cultural information reveals specific portions of Tibetan popular and Buddhist practices in concrete terms and actions. Even the most basic question, such as what indigenous terms are used for prayer flags, demonstrates a rich complexity behind these modest items. In conclusion, I found that prayer flags are a visual, material reminder of the spiritual practice of Buddhism that many indigenous communities across Nepal and Tibet practice. I want to share this poem from Sudip San, an Indian poet, which is appropriately titled Prayer Flags. She was only an accidental figure in the widescreen frame. Unlike her, I was looking skywards through the prayer flag's translucent cotton, counting each thread, each piece of cloth that wove private stories whispered only to me. Weather-worn, strung across, canted multiple horizons. I tried to map their own geographies, each an island, each with its own terrain and texture, inscription and scripture, found on the highest points on land, as close to the sky as possible. These magic carpets, shapes caught on an unintentional clothesline, were more meaningful to me than this vast monastic scenery. How each flag, each one, must have preserved secrets that only their owners knew. How each, a talisman, exuded safety and calm, shrouding away grief for the briefest while, when one forgets everything, real, imagined, and just dreams. Namaste.
अर्को जन्म हुन्छ भने दोहोऱ्याएर फेरि तिमीसँगै बितौँ मुस्कानले सजौँला तिमीलाई पिरती भाका गुनगुनाऊ